An image captured in 1872 showing something impossible. At the center of a Victorian family portrait, among serious faces and rigid poses typical of the era, appears the translucent face of a girl. A girl who, according to parish records, had died 3 months before the photograph was taken. But what is truly disturbing is not just her presence in this image. It is the fact that she began appearing in all subsequent portraits of this family. Every photograph, every occasion, every attempt to capture the memory of the living was invaded by the image of this dead child. For 14 years, no photographer could explain the phenomenon. No technique of the time could prevent it. And when it finally ceased, the reason was even more bewildering than the mystery itself. The story begins in a small village in the English countryside called Ashworth, a place where the morning fog rarely dissipates completely and where Victorian traditions were followed with almost religious rigor. The village sat nestled in a shallow valley, surrounded by rolling hills that seemed to trap the mist like a bowl holds water. The main street was lined with grey stone cottages, their slate roofs dark with perpetual dampness. At one end stood the Norman church of St. Michael's, its square tower visible for miles around. At the other end was the marketplace, where farmers brought their produce every Thursday morning and where gossip spread faster than any news from London. It was the summer of 1872, and photography was still considered relatively new technology, surrounded by superstitions and misunderstandings. The process had been around for only about 30 years, and many people in rural areas had never had their picture taken. Many peasants believed that cameras could capture the soul, while others saw in the ghostly images from long exposure times signs of spiritual presence. There were whispered stories of people who had been photographed and died shortly thereafter, though whether the photograph caused the death or simply documented someone already ill was never quite clear. The wet collodion process, the dominant technique of the era, required subjects to remain absolutely motionless for up to 30 seconds. The photographer would coat a glass plate with a sticky solution of collodion mixed with light-sensitive salts, expose it while still wet, and then immediately develop it in a portable darkroom. Any movement resulted in blurs and spectral forms in the final image. It was not uncommon to see photographs where children appeared as ghostly streaks, having moved during the long exposure despite their parents' stern warnings to stay still. But what happened with the Whitfield family transcended any known technical explanation. It would become a case studied by scientists, spiritualists, and skeptics alike, debated in the halls of the Royal Photographic Society and whispered about in village pubs for generations. Margaret Ann Whitfield was only 7 years old when she contracted scarlet fever in March 1872. She was the youngest of 3 children, born to Thomas and Eleanor Whitfield on a crisp October morning in 1864. By all accounts, she was a spirited child, full of laughter and mischief, with golden hair that her mother would tie with ribbons and dark eyes that seemed too large for her small face. Her eldest brother, James, was 14 and already working as an apprentice in their father's textile business. He was serious and studious, always with his nose in a book, dreaming of attending university in Cambridge. The middle child, William, was 11, more adventurous and prone to getting into trouble. He would take Margaret on expeditions through the fields around Ashworth, teaching her the names of wildflowers and how to skip stones across the mill pond. Eleanor Whitfield kept a detailed diary, as was common for educated Victorian women. In it, she recorded the mundane details of daily life, the weather, visitors, household expenses, and observations about her children. On March 12, 1872, she wrote, "Margaret complained of a headache this afternoon and felt warm to the touch. I have put her to bed with a cool compress and a cup of chamomile tea. She insists it is nothing and that she will be well enough to attend church on Sunday." But Margaret was not well on Sunday. The disease caused by the bacterium Streptococcus pyogenes was one of the leading causes of infant mortality in the Victorian era. The symptoms began with high fever and a characteristic rash that gave the skin a rough texture similar to sandpaper. The rash started on Margaret's chest and spread across her body, turning her pale skin bright red. Her throat became so swollen she could barely swallow, and her tongue developed what doctors of the time called strawberry tongue, covered with small red bumps. Within days, the girl was delirious, her small body consumed by infection. Eleanor's diary entries from this period are heart-wrenching in their desperation. March 15, Margaret's fever continues. Dr. Pemberton has been twice today. He says we must keep her comfortable and pray. March 17, she does not recognize me. She calls for someone named Annie, though we know no one by that name. Thomas sits with her through the night, reading to her from her favorite books, though I doubt she can hear him. March 20, she is peaceful today, but so terribly weak. Her little hand in mine feels like a bird's wing, all bone and delicate skin. The doctors of the time could do little more than apply leeches to draw out bad blood, prescribe rest, and recommend various tonics that did nothing to combat the bacterial infection. Dr. Pemberton, the village physician, was a kind man but limited by the medical knowledge of his era. Modern medicine was still decades away from the discovery of antibiotics. Penicillin would not be discovered until 1928, more than 50 years too late for Margaret. Margaret passed away on a rainy April afternoon, specifically April 23, 1872, surrounded by her mother, her father, and her two older brothers. The house on Mill Lane where the Whitfields lived was filled with the smell of carbolic acid, which Eleanor had been using to try to disinfect everything Margaret touched. When the end came, it was quiet. Margaret simply stopped breathing, her chest ceasing its labored rise and fall, her face relaxing into an expression of peace that had been absent for weeks. Eleanor's diary entry for that day reads simply, "She is gone. The light has gone out of this house." She was buried in the local church cemetery under a modest gray marble headstone that simply stated her name and the dates that marked her brief existence, Margaret and Whitfield, 1864 to 1872. Beloved daughter. Gone too soon. The funeral was attended by most of the village. Margaret had been a favorite at the village school, always ready with a smile or a kind word. Her teacher, Miss Hartley, wept openly at the graveside. Victorian mourning had strict and ritualistic codes. Bereaved families wore black clothing for determined periods, with different stages of mourning requiring different degrees of black and different accessories. Full mourning for a child could last 2 years. Families covered mirrors with dark cloths, supposedly to prevent the deceased's spirit from becoming trapped in the reflection. They stopped all social activities, did not attend parties or celebrations, and followed elaborate protocols of social isolation. Post-mortem photography was a common and accepted practice, perhaps the most unsettling custom to modern sensibilities. Many families hired photographers to capture a final image of their deceased loved ones, frequently positioning the bodies as if they were merely sleeping, surrounded by flowers and personal objects. Sometimes the dead were propped up in chairs or even standing, supported by hidden stands, their eyes occasionally painted onto their closed eyelids to make them appear alive. The Whitfields, however, did not do this. Thomas Whitfield found the practice macabre and refused, despite Eleanor's gentle insistence that they would have no image of their daughter to remember her by. "I will not remember her as a corpse," he said firmly. "I will remember her as she was, full of life and joy." They chose to preserve Margaret's memory as she was in life, vibrant and full of energy, through their recollections and the stories they would tell. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. 3 months after the funeral, in July 1872, the family decided to commission a formal portrait. It was a practice that middle-class families occasionally did, a significant investment that resulted in a single precious image to be displayed in the living room. A good photographic portrait could cost a week's wages or more, making it a luxury reserved for special occasions. The father, Thomas Whitfield, was a prosperous textile merchant who had built his business from nothing. His warehouse on the edge of Ashworth stored bolts of wool, cotton, and silk that he sold to tailors and dressmakers throughout the county. He employed 6 men and had contracts with mills as far away as Manchester. He had postponed commissioning a family portrait for years due to the cost, but now felt that the family needed something to mark this difficult period, a way to show that they would continue, even with Margaret gone. An itinerant photographer named Albert Graves had established his temporary studio in the village, advertising his expertise in the new technique of family portraiture. He had placed notices in the local newspaper and had distributed handbills at the marketplace. The handbills showed examples of his work, stiff, formal portraits of families and individuals, all looking directly at the camera with serious expressions. Smiling was rare in Victorian photographs, partly because the long exposure times made it difficult to hold a smile, and partly because having one's photograph taken was considered a serious, dignified affair. The Whitfield scheduled a session for a Saturday morning, July 20, 1872. The night before, Eleanor had laid out their finest clothes, brushing and pressing them carefully. Thomas's 3-piece suit of dark wool, Eleanor's black silk dress adorned with Chantilly lace at the collar and cuffs, a concession to mourning, and the boys' formal jackets and bow ties. William had grown since his last formal outfit was made, and the sleeves of his jacket were a bit short, but it would have to do. Graves' studio was set up in a converted warehouse near the canal, with large north-facing windows that provided the ideal diffused light for photography. Northern light was preferred because it was consistent throughout the day, without the harsh shadows that direct sunlight would create. The warehouse had been empty for years, previously used to store grain, and still smelled faintly of wheat and mice. Inside, Graves had created a professional portrait space. A large painted backdrop depicted a genteel interior with columns and drapery, giving the impression of a grand house even though most of his subjects lived in modest cottages. There was an ornate chair, a small table with a vase of artificial flowers, and several props, books, a globe, a violin that Graves couldn't actually play but that looked impressive in portraits. The family arrived promptly at 10 o'clock on that Saturday morning. The boys were uncomfortable in their stiff collars, and William kept tugging at his bow tie until his mother swatted his hand away. Graves greeted them warmly, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and ink-stained fingers from handling photographic chemicals. He had a nervous energy about him, constantly moving, adjusting things, checking the light. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," he said, though there was nothing comfortable about the setup. He positioned them carefully, Thomas standing at the back with one hand on Eleanor's shoulder as she sat in the ornate chair, James standing to his father's right, and William to his mother's left. Graves used metal head supports, hidden behind their figures, to keep them absolutely still during the long exposure. These supports had adjustable clamps that pressed against the back of the head and could be hidden behind the body or disguised with curtains in the backdrop. "Now, very important," Graves instructed, "you must not move. Not even blink if you can help it. Look directly at the camera lens, think pleasant thoughts, and remain absolutely still. The exposure will take approximately 25 to 30 seconds. If you move, even slightly, you will appear blurred in the final image." He disappeared under the black cloth of his bellows camera, a large wooden box on a heavy tripod, adjusted the focus by sliding the front lens assembly back and forth, and then emerged to begin the meticulous process of preparing the glass plate with the collodion emulsion. He did this in a small area he had curtained off with heavy black cloth to serve as a makeshift darkroom. The family could hear him working, the clink of glass bottles, the splash of liquid, his muttered counting as he timed each step of the process. The collodion had to be poured onto the glass plate in just the right amount, tilted to spread it evenly, then sensitized in a bath of silver nitrate solution, all within a few minutes before it dried. When he emerged, he was holding the prepared plate in a light-tight wooden holder. "Ready now," he said, sliding the plate holder into the back of the camera. He removed the dark slide that protected the plate, checked one more time that everyone was still in position, and then removed the lens cap. "Remember, perfectly still," he said softly, and began counting. 1, 2, 3. The family froze. Thomas concentrated on a point just above the camera lens. Eleanor tried not to think about how uncomfortable the metal support was against the back of her head. James thought about the mathematical problem he had been working on that morning. William imagined he was a statue in a museum, ancient and immovable. 23, 24, 25. Graves replaced the lens cap and reinserted the dark slide. Excellent. You may relax now. The family breathed out collectively, moving their stiff limbs, blinking their dry eyes. Thomas helped Eleanor out of the chair, and the boys immediately loosened their bow ties. When will the photograph be ready? Thomas asked. I will develop it this afternoon and have a print for you by Monday, Graves replied. You can collect it here, or I can deliver it to your home if you prefer. We'll collect it, Thomas said, handing over the agreed-upon payment. Everything had followed standard protocol. There had been no unusual occurrences, no cold spots or strange feelings, no technical difficulties. The exposure lasted exactly 25 seconds. The family did not move. But when Graves developed the plate that afternoon in his makeshift laboratory, his hands steady from years of practice as he poured the developer over the exposed glass, he was paralyzed by what appeared before his eyes. There, among the family figures, floating slightly above and behind Eleanor's right shoulder, was the translucent face of a small girl. Graves stood frozen in the dim red light of his darkroom, the glass plate dripping developer onto his workbench. He blinked hard, thinking perhaps the chemical fumes were affecting his vision, but when he looked again, the face was still there. The image was unmistakable. Large, dark eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera, light hair tied with a ribbon, and a serene, almost dreamy expression. The face was slightly transparent, allowing the dark backdrop to show through, but the features were sharp and clear. Graves was an experienced professional. He had worked with photography for over 15 years, starting as an assistant in London before setting out on his own to tour the provinces. He was familiar with all types of technical defects, chemical stains from contaminated solutions, light leaks from poorly sealed plate holders, damaged plates with scratches or bubbles in the glass, accidental movements that created ghost images. But this was different. The figure was not a blur or a streak. It was sharp, defined, and clearly the image of a child. A child who was not present during the session. He developed the plate fully, fixed it, washed it, and examined it under strong light. The girl's image remained, integrated into the emulsion just as solidly as the images of the 4 family members. There were no signs of double exposure, no telltale overlapping of edges that would indicate the plate had been exposed twice. Graves spent a sleepless weekend, examining the plate again and again, checking his chemicals, his camera, his darkroom procedures. He found nothing wrong. On Monday morning, he printed the photograph with trembling hands, watching as the same impossible image appeared in the developing tray. The photographer brought the image to the Whitfields with extreme caution, rehearsing what he would say, fearing their reaction. He arrived at the Mill Lane house just after breakfast, his stomach churning with anxiety. Thomas answered the door, surprised to see Graves looking so pale and agitated. "Is there a problem with the photograph?" he asked. I'm not certain," Graves stammered. "Perhaps it would be best if you looked at it yourself." They went into the parlor, where Eleanor was doing needlework and the boys were at their studies. Graves unwrapped the photograph from its protective paper with hands that shook slightly. When Eleanor saw the photograph, she did not scream. She did not faint. Instead, her legs slowly gave way, and she sat heavily in a chair, her needlework falling forgotten to the floor. Her eyes were fixed on the impossible image, and the color drained from her face as if someone had opened a tap. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, leaning closer. It's Margaret." James and William crowded around, their lessons forgotten. William let out a small gasp, and James went very still and quiet, his face unreadable. There was no doubt. Every detail was perfect. The specific tilt of her head, the way she always held it when she was curious about something, the shape of her lips, slightly parted as if about to speak. Even the ribbon was right, the blue ribbon she used to wear in her hair, her favorite one that Eleanor had buried with her, wrapped around her small, cold hands. How is this possible? Thomas demanded, turning to Graves. What trickery is this? Sir, I swear to you, there is no trickery, Graves said earnestly. I am as mystified as you are. I have examined the plate thoroughly. There is no double exposure, no manipulation. I cannot explain it. Thomas examined the photograph under the strong morning light streaming through the parlor window, holding it close to his face, then at arm's length, tilting it to catch the light from different angles. He was looking for scratches in the negative that could have created a face-like pattern, for signs of artistic retouching, for any evidence of deliberate fraud. He found none. Eleanor reached out with a trembling hand and took the photograph from him. She traced the outline of Margaret's face with one finger, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She looks peaceful, she whispered. She looks happy. The brothers remained silent, divided between fear and something they could not name. Was it comfort? Terror? Or simply the vertigo of witnessing something that should not exist? I want to examine your equipment, Thomas said to Graves. Your camera, your plates, everything. Of course, sir, Graves agreed immediately. I welcome it. I want an explanation as much as you do. They went to Graves' studio that very afternoon. Thomas brought along Edward Morrison, a friend who had studied chemistry at university and who had an interest in photography himself. Morrison was a skeptical man by nature, a bank clerk who believed in numbers and ledgers and things that could be proven. They examined everything: the camera, a standard bellows design with a brass-bound lens manufactured by Ross in London, the stock of unused glass plates, clear and unblemished, the chemicals, all standard formulas that Graves mixed himself from purchased powders, the darkroom procedures, which Graves demonstrated step by step. Morrison even prepared and exposed a fresh plate himself, photographing an empty chair in the studio. When he developed it under Graves' supervision, only the chair appeared. No ghostly faces, no unexplained forms. I find no evidence of fraud, Morrison admitted reluctantly. But that doesn't mean I can accept what this photograph appears to show. There must be a rational explanation. But what? Thomas asked, frustrated. What rational explanation could there be? Morrison had no answer. Graves insisted there was no trick, no deliberate manipulation. In the Victorian era, before the advent of digital photography, creating a convincing double exposure required considerable technical skill and, crucially, would be impossible to do without prior knowledge of the appearance of the person to be inserted into the image. Graves had never met Margaret. He had never even seen a drawing of her. He had moved to Ashworth only 2 weeks before the photograph was taken, arriving from a stint in Bristol. How could he have fabricated her image with such precision? The family, after days of agonizing deliberation, decided to keep the photograph. They did not destroy it, though Thomas's first impulse had been to burn it in the fireplace. They did not hide it in a drawer or attic trunk. After much discussion and prayer, they placed it prominently in their home, framed in dark mahogany, hanging on the parlor wall where visitors would see it immediately upon entering. The decision was Eleanor's, ultimately. She wants us to know she's still here, Eleanor said firmly on the third day, her tears finally dried up, replaced by a strange calm. She's telling us she hasn't truly left. How can I reject that message? How can I turn her away? Visitors were disturbed when they saw the photograph and heard the story. Some crossed themselves and left quickly. Others lectured the family about the dangers of spiritualism and the devil's tricks. But the family had reached a peculiar conclusion. Perhaps Margaret was trying to tell them she was well, that she had somehow continued with them, watching over them from wherever she was now. Dr. Pemberton, the physician who had attended Margaret in her final illness, came to see the photograph and left shaken. "I don't know what to make of it," he told Thomas. "I am a man of science, but I have seen things in my years of practice that science cannot yet explain." The vicar of St. Michael's, Reverend Blackwood, was less charitable. He visited the household and declared the photograph to be ungodly. "You are meddling with forces beyond your understanding," he warned. "The dead should rest, and the living should not seek to disturb them. This image, whatever its source, is not a blessing. It is a test, and you are failing it by keeping this unholy thing in your home." But Eleanor would not be swayed. "Margaret is my daughter," she said quietly but firmly. "She was baptized in your church, Reverend. She sang in the children's choir. If her soul wishes to make itself known, to give us comfort, I will not turn her away." 9 months later, in April 1873, exactly 1 year after Margaret's death, the family commissioned another portrait. Thomas was reluctant, but Eleanor insisted. "I want to see if it will happen again," she said. "I need to know if she's still with us." This time they hired a different photographer, a man from London named Frederick Hayes, who had established a permanent studio in Coventry, the neighbouring town about 12 miles from Ashworth. Hayes had an impeccable reputation, with a gallery on the high street displaying portraits of local dignitaries, and even, he claimed, members of the minor nobility. Hayes was a very different character from Graves. Where Graves had been nervous and eager to please, Hayes was confident and slightly pompous. He was a large man with impressive mutton chop whiskers and a gold watch chain stretched across his considerable stomach. He spoke with the affected accent of someone trying to sound more upper-class than he actually was. The family did not mention the previous photograph. They did not want to influence the photographer or create expectations. When Thomas contacted Hayes to arrange the sitting, he simply said they wanted a family portrait, nothing more. The session occurred without incident on a bright Saturday afternoon in April. Hayes's studio was far more elaborate than Graves' temporary setup had been. It was located on the second floor of a building on Coventry High Street, with a large skylight that provided abundant natural light. The walls were covered with examples of Hayes's work in gilt frames, and the space smelled of lavender water and photographic chemicals. Hayes posed them differently than Graves had. This time, Thomas and Eleanor sat side by side in matching chairs, with James standing behind his father's shoulder and William behind his mother's. Hayes was meticulous, checking every aspect of his equipment twice, adjusting the angle of the light with large white reflector panels, fussing with the drape of Eleanor's skirt and the position of Thomas's hands. "Photography is an art as much as a science," Hayes pronounced. "One must have an eye for composition, for the balance of light and shadow, for the arrangement of forms. Any fool can expose a plate, but it takes an artist to create a true portrait." The exposure took 30 seconds, and when it was done, Hayes assured them that the results would be exceptional, absolutely exceptional. He would have the finished portraits ready in a week, and they could be collected or delivered for a small additional fee. When Hayes developed the plate in his well-equipped darkroom behind the studio, using chemicals from London's finest photographic suppliers, he felt his blood run cold. There she was again. The same girl. This time, she appeared beside William, her translucent form perfectly sharp against the dark background of the studio. She was turned slightly toward him, as if trying to get his attention, and there was something in her expression, a playfulness that Hayes, looking at it with the eye of an experienced portraitist, found both charming and deeply unsettling. Hayes stared at the wet plate for a full minute, unable to move or think clearly. He had photographed hundreds of people, perhaps thousands in his career. He had seen all manner of technical failures and oddities. But never anything like this. He developed 3 prints from the negative, examining each one carefully. The girl appeared in all 3, identical in each, her position and expression unchanging. She was part of the negative, part of the image itself, not an artifact of the printing process. The following Tuesday, when Thomas and James arrived to collect the portraits, Hayes confronted them with barely controlled anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, thrusting the photograph at Thomas. "What kind of elaborate prank are you trying to pull? Are you attempting to ruin my reputation?" Thomas took one look at the photograph and felt his knees weaken. "It's happened again," he said quietly. "What has happened again?" Hayes sputtered. "Explain yourself, sir." When Thomas, with help from James, explained that Margaret was their deceased daughter and showed Hayes a copy of the photograph taken by Graves the previous year, Hayes's anger drained away, replaced by confusion and something close to fear. "This is impossible," he kept saying. "Impossible. I have been a photographer for 20 years. I know every trick, every technique. There is no way to produce such an effect without deliberate manipulation, and I swear to you, I did not manipulate anything." James, who at 15 was becoming more confident and articulate, spoke up. "Mr. Hayes, we are not accusing you of anything. We are as bewildered as you are. This is the second time this has happened. We don't understand it either." Hayes sat down heavily in one of his posing chairs, the photograph still in his hand. "I photographed a Methodist minister just this morning," he said, seemingly to himself. "He came out perfectly normal. I photographed the mayor's family last week. Normal. Why would your daughter, why would this apparition, appear only in your family's photographs?" "We don't know," Thomas said. "We were hoping it might not happen again. But it seems we were wrong." Hayes demanded to see the original photograph taken by Graves. Thomas arranged for him to visit the Ashworth house the next day, bringing with him all his equipment and records from the sitting. Edward Morrison joined them again, as did 2 other men, Dr. Pemberton and a local solicitor named Alastair Finch who had an interest in scientific matters. The 5 men spent an entire afternoon examining both photographs, comparing them in minute detail. Margaret's appearance was different in each image, different pose, different position, different expression. But it was unmistakably the same girl. "Could you have used the same defective plate as Mr. Graves?" Morrison asked Hayes. "Impossible," Hayes replied. "I purchase my plates directly from Liverpool. They come in sealed boxes of 1 dozen. I opened a fresh box for your sitting, I do so for each important commission. And even if somehow Graves and I had obtained plates from the same defective batch, which is statistically impossible given that we use different suppliers, a defect would appear in the same location on every plate. These are different images of the same subject. Could there have been another child present during the exposure, hiding behind a curtain perhaps, who moved at just the right moment to appear translucent?" Finch suggested. "My studio has no curtains in the photographing area," Hayes said. "Only the backdrop. And I was present the entire time. There was no other person in the room besides the family and myself." Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat. "I hate to suggest it, but we must consider the possibility that we are witnessing a genuine supernatural phenomenon." The room fell silent. These were rational Victorian men, educated, modern, believers in progress and science. The suggestion that they might be dealing with something beyond natural law was deeply uncomfortable. "There must be another explanation," Morrison insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. The news began to spread. In a time before sensationalist tabloids, news traveled through letters, conversations in markets and church sermons, but in small communities like Ashworth, it traveled fast. The story of the girl who appeared in photographs after her death captured the morbidly fascinated imagination of the local community. Within a month, the story had reached Coventry, then Birmingham, then London. Letters arrived at the Whitfield household from spiritualists, from photographers, from scientists, from the simply curious. Some offered explanations, most of which were nonsensical. Others wanted to examine the photographs themselves, or to photograph the family under their supervision. Some saw it as proof of the afterlife, evidence that the soul persisted beyond death and could make itself known to the living. The spiritualist movement was at its height in the 1870s, with séances being conducted in parlors throughout Britain and America. Mediums claimed to communicate with the dead, and spirit photography, supposedly capturing images of ghosts, was becoming increasingly popular, though most examples were obvious frauds involving double exposures and clever darkroom tricks. Others saw the phenomenon as evidence that the Whitfield family was cursed, touched by dark forces that should not be meddled with. Reverend Blackwood preached a sermon in which he declared that the family was being tested by God and that they had failed by not destroying the photographs immediately. The dead should remain dead, he thundered from the pulpit. To seek signs from them is to invite the devil into your home. A local vicar from another parish, a more liberal-minded man named Reverend Thomas Wright, took a different view. He visited the Whitfields and examined the photographs carefully. "I see no evil here," he said. "I see only the image of a child, and the love of a family that cannot let her go. If God chooses to grant you the comfort of knowing she persists, who are we to reject that blessing?" But there were also those with more scientific minds, members of the Royal Photographic Society and researchers of spiritual phenomena who wanted to investigate. Letters arrived from the Society requesting permission to examine the photographs and possibly to conduct controlled experiments with the family. Thomas was torn. Part of him wanted to refuse all of this attention, to protect his family's privacy and to simply live with the mystery. But another part of him wanted answers, wanted to know whether his daughter's soul was truly present or whether they were all victims of some elaborate hoax or strange technical phenomenon. Eleanor, surprisingly, was enthusiastic about the scientific investigation. "If Margaret is trying to communicate with us, perhaps these men of learning can help us understand what she's trying to say," she reasoned. "And if it's not truly her, if it's some strange trick of science, then we should know that as well." Between 1873 and 1886, the Whitfield family was photographed 17 additional times. Each photographer was different, each location different. Some sittings were in studios, others outdoors in gardens or public parks. Once, in 1878, they were photographed at a traveling fair by a visiting American photographer named Joshua Clement who was using the new dry plate process, a recent innovation that didn't require immediate development of the plates. In all 17 photographs, Margaret appeared. Sometimes she was in the background, a small face barely visible among shadows. Other times, she was surprisingly close, as if trying to approach a specific family member. In the 1875 photograph, she appeared next to James, who by then was a young man of 17 working full-time in his father's business. In the 1879 photograph, taken outdoors in the family's garden, she appeared to be standing among the roses, her form becoming visible only where it overlapped with the darker background of a hedge. And in a particularly disturbing photograph from 1879, taken by a scientific photographer from the Royal Society, she appeared looking directly at the camera, her eyes seeming to follow the observer regardless of the viewing angle. Thomas found that particular image so unsettling that he kept it in a drawer rather than displayed with the others. The investigations were extensive and remarkably thorough for the era. The story had attracted significant attention, and serious researchers were determined to either prove or disprove the phenomenon. Investigators of the time meticulously documented each case. Glass plates were examined by experts from the Royal Photographic Society, including some of the leading photographers and chemists in Britain. Cameras were inspected for defects, unusual modifications, or hidden compartments that might allow for trick photography. Chemists analyzed the emulsions used on the photographic plates, looking for contaminants or unusual compounds that might produce unexpected images. No conventional explanation was found. Professor Henry Ashworth, a chemist from Cambridge University, spent 3 days in the summer of 1874 examining the Whitfield photographs. He subjected the glass plates to every test he could devise, using microscopes to examine the grain of the emulsion, analyzing samples of the glass itself, even attempting to chemically strip away the image layer by layer to see if Margaret's image was somehow layered differently than the rest of the photograph. The image is integrated into the emulsion in exactly the same way as the images of the living family members, he reported in a paper he presented to the Royal Society later that year. The silver particles that form her image are no different from those that form the image of her father or brothers. If this is a fraud, it is executed with such skill and technical sophistication that I cannot detect it, and I have spent my entire career studying photographic processes. The double exposure theory was examined and quickly discarded. To create a double exposure, the photographer would need to expose the same plate twice, once with the family, and once with Margaret's image. But how would this be possible when different photographers, using different equipment in different locations, all captured the same apparition? Furthermore, Margaret's position changed in each photograph, sometimes appearing in locations that would have been physically impossible for a real person to occupy during exposure. In a photograph from 1881, taken outdoors during a family picnic, she appeared partially merged with a marble column in the background, her ghostly form passing through solid matter as if it weren't there. The photographer, a Mr. Gerald Hopkins from Oxford, had been so disturbed by the result that he had initially refused to deliver the photograph, claiming it must be his fault somehow, though he couldn't explain how. The psychological explanation was also considered seriously. Could it be pareidolia? The human tendency to see faces and patterns in random stimuli, like seeing animals in clouds or a man in the moon. Perhaps natural defects in the photographic plates, random patterns in the silver emulsion, were creating forms that the family, in their grief, interpreted as Margaret's image. Dr. Richard Carpenter, a physician interested in the emerging field of psychology, proposed this theory in a letter to the British Medical Journal in 1875. The human mind, particularly when traumatized by loss, can perceive patterns that align with its deepest desires, he wrote. What appears to this family as their deceased daughter may be nothing more than stains and imperfections that their grief-stricken minds have shaped into a familiar face. But this theory fell apart under scrutiny. Dozens of independent people, including professional photographers, scientists, and even declared skeptics who had never met the family and had no emotional investment in the case, examined the photographs. All of them identified the same figure. All of them saw not an ambiguous stain or a play of light and shadow, but clearly and unmistakably a girl. And family members who had known Margaret in life insisted, with absolute certainty, that it was undeniably her. It's not just that we see a child, James explained to one investigator in 1876. We see Margaret. We see the way she held her head, the exact shape of her face, even the ribbon she loved to wear. These are not random patterns. These are specific, recognizable details. One of the most fascinating theories came from a researcher of psychic phenomena named Dr. William Hartley, who studied the case extensively in 1883. Hartley was associated with the Society for Psychical Research, though he was more scientifically minded than many spiritualists of the time. He conducted interviews with the family, examined all the photographs, and even attempted to photograph them himself, though without success, as Margaret did not appear in his images. Hartley proposed that perhaps photographic plates, with their light-sensitive silver emulsion, were capable of capturing something beyond the normal visible spectrum. We know that the camera sees things the human eye cannot, he argued in his published monograph on the case. It can capture wavelengths of light at the edges of human perception. What if consciousness itself, or some residual energy of consciousness after death, exists in a form that interacts with light in ways we do not yet understand? He theorized that certain intense emotional conditions, such as a family's deep love and grief, could create some kind of energetic impression that manifested when light was captured by the chemical emulsion. "Consider how a magnet creates an invisible field," he wrote. "We cannot see magnetism, but we can observe its effects on iron filings. Perhaps love and loss create similar fields, normally invisible, but detectable by the sensitive chemical medium of a photographic plate." It was a theory that sounded absurd, even by the standards of the time. But no more absurd than the alternative, that the dead could literally appear in photographs. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882 with the stated goal of investigating paranormal phenomena with scientific rigor, sent investigators to document the case thoroughly. The society was led by respected scholars, including philosophers, scientists, and even a future prime minister. They were determined to separate genuine phenomena from fraud and delusion. In the summer of 1884, they conducted a series of controlled experiments photographing the family under rigorously monitored conditions. The investigators brought their own camera, purchased brand new glass plates directly from the manufacturer in sealed boxes, and supervised every step of the process from exposure to development. The sittings took place over 3 days in August, in a rented hall in Ashworth that the investigators had examined thoroughly beforehand. They checked for hidden compartments, mirrors, or any apparatus that might be used for trickery. They marked the photographic plates with scratches on the corners to ensure the same plates were used from exposure through development. One investigator, a former stage magician named Edward Keller who had made a career of exposing fraudulent mediums, was particularly thorough, even checking the family members' clothing for hidden devices. 5 photographs were taken over those 3 days. In the first sitting, the family was photographed against a plain white sheet, with no backdrop or props that could hide accomplices or devices. Margaret appeared, a faint but distinct figure standing beside Eleanor. In the second sitting, the family was photographed outdoors in bright sunlight, in the churchyard of St. Michael's, ironically near Margaret's grave. She appeared in this photograph as well, more faintly, almost invisible in the bright light, but unmistakably present when the print was examined closely. The third sitting produced no apparition. The investigators noted that this sitting had taken place during a thunderstorm, and they wondered if atmospheric conditions might play a role. The fourth sitting, back indoors with controlled lighting, showed Margaret again, this time appearing between her 2 brothers. The fifth and final sitting produced no apparition, and the investigators could identify no variable that had changed from the fourth sitting that might explain the difference. Margaret appeared in 3 of the 5 photographs from these controlled tests. The investigators were divided. Some believed they had found genuine evidence of paranormal phenomena. Professor Barrett, a physicist from Dublin, wrote in his official report, "I have examined every aspect of these experiments with the utmost scrutiny. I can find no evidence of fraud or deception. If this is trickery, it is beyond any methods known to stage magic or photographic manipulation." Others suspected elaborate fraud, though they could not identify how it was being executed. Richard Hodgson, an Australian investigator known for his skepticism and his success in exposing fraudulent mediums, spent weeks trying to recreate the effect. He experimented with double exposures, with painting on glass plates, with chemical treatments that might produce face-like patterns. He created many strange images, but none that resembled the Whitfield photographs. The clarity, the consistency, and the specific recognizable features of Margaret's image eluded his every attempt at replication. Either this family has access to photographic techniques unknown to professional photographers and stage magicians, Hodgson concluded reluctantly, or we are witnessing something that cannot be explained by current scientific understanding. The debate within the Society for Psychical Research became heated. Some members resigned, declaring that the society was being too credulous. Others doubled down, arguing that this was exactly the kind of phenomenon they had been founded to investigate. The controversy even reached the popular press. The Illustrated London News published a feature article in 1885 with illustrations based on the photographs, though they couldn't reproduce the actual images in their publication. The article presented both sides of the debate, interviewing both believers and skeptics, and left the question open for readers to decide. The impact on the family was profound and complex, evolving over the years as they adapted to their strange reality. The father, Thomas Whitfield, initially skeptical and angry, gradually accepted the apparitions as a form of Margaret's continuing presence. His diary entries, which he began keeping in 1875 at the suggestion of investigators, track his emotional journey. January 1875, another photographer, another appearance. I no longer feel anger or fear. Instead, I feel a strange comfort. If Margaret's soul persists and chooses to make itself known to us, how can that be anything but a blessing? Perhaps we are privileged to receive proof of what the Church teaches us to accept on faith alone. September 1877, James asked me today if I think Margaret is truly present, or if we are somehow creating her image through the force of our desire. I had no answer for him. Does it matter? Whether she is truly there or we are somehow calling her forth through our need, the result is the same. She remains with us. March 1881, William said something interesting today. He said perhaps Margaret appears in photographs because she knows we will keep them, treasure them, look at them for years. If she appeared in ordinary life, we might doubt our senses, might think we were mad. But a photograph is proof, is permanent. Perhaps this is the only way she can communicate that we will believe. Thomas became something of a local authority on the case, corresponding with investigators, hosting visits from researchers, and maintaining meticulous records of each photograph. He had the photographs professionally documented, with detailed notes about the date, location, photographer, and conditions of each sitting. The mother, Eleanor, oscillated between comfort and anguish. Her diary entries from this period are heart-wrenching to read. April 1873, she appeared again. I wept with joy and sorrow both. Joy that she has not abandoned us, sorrow that this photograph is all I can have of her. I cannot hold her, cannot brush her hair, cannot kiss her goodnight. The photograph mocks me with what I have lost, even as it comforts me with the suggestion that not all is lost. December 1876, I had the most terrible thought today. What if we are trapping her? What if she should be at peace, should have moved on to whatever comes next, but our need holds her here? What if our photographs are chains that bind her to this world? I shared this fear with Thomas, and he reassured me, but I see that the same thought has occurred to him. June 1880, I spend hours looking at the photographs now. I have them all arranged on the mantel and the side tables, a gallery of impossibility. Margaret at 7, forever 7, while her brothers grow into men. It is a strange kind of torture, this gift we have been given. Eleanor's emotional state became a concern to Dr. Pemberton, who visited regularly. He worried that the photographs, rather than bringing closure, were preventing her from completing the grieving process. But Eleanor herself was clear about what she wanted. I will never have closure, she told the doctor firmly in 1881. Margaret is my daughter, and that bond does not end with death. If she wishes to remain close to us in this way, I will not reject her. Would you reject your own child? The brothers, James and William, growing up with this phenomenon as a normal part of their lives, developed complicated relationships with their sister's memory. James, the eldest, became increasingly interested in the scientific aspects of the mystery. By 1880, he had read everything published about the case and had begun conducting his own research into photographic chemistry and spiritualism. He corresponded with members of the Society for Psychical Research and even presented a paper to a local scientific society in 1883 about his experiences. Living with the Impossible, a personal account of the Whitfield photographs, was published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research in 1884. In it, James wrote with remarkable objectivity about his sister's appearances. I have seen my deceased sister's image appear in photographs more than a dozen times. I have been present at controlled experiments that eliminate the possibility of fraud. I have examined the glass plates under magnification and found nothing that suggests manipulation. Yet I remain uncertain about what this phenomenon represents. Is it truly Margaret's soul making itself visible? Is it some unknown property of photographic chemistry that responds to emotion or memory? Or is it something else entirely, something we lack the framework to understand? I live in the uncertainty, in the space between wonder and skepticism, and I find that space both uncomfortable and strangely illuminating. William, more emotionally driven than his brother, struggled with the phenomenon in different ways. In his private writings, preserved in the family papers, he expressed both connection and loss. 1879, Margaret appeared in the photograph next to me today, so close I felt I could almost touch her. But when I reached toward the image, there was only paper and glass. She is here and not here, present and absent. It is maddening. I would rather she were fully gone and I could mourn properly, or fully here and we could be a complete family again. This halfway state is torture. 1883, I dreamed last night that Margaret spoke to me. She said she was sorry for confusing us, for causing us pain. She said she didn't know how to leave, didn't know how to let go. I woke with tears on my face. It was only a dream, but it felt true. Perhaps that is the answer we've been seeking. Perhaps she is as trapped as we are, held by bonds of love that neither the living nor the dead know how to break. In their diaries, preserved in the archives of the Ashworth Historical Society, the brothers often wrote about their sister, processing their complicated feelings about her unusual presence in their lives. In 1885, when William was 23, he wrote, "Sometimes I forget Margaret has departed. When I see her face in the photographs, it seems she is merely in another room, out of reach but not truly absent. Other times, the photographs remind me forcefully of her death, and I am overcome with grief as fresh as the day she died. The photographs do not let us forget, and I cannot decide if this is blessing or curse." The phenomenon affected their social lives as well. James found it difficult to court young women. When they learned about his family's strange situation, many were frightened or disturbed. William, more sociable by nature, learned to simply not mention it, though this created its own problems when relationships became serious enough that meeting the family was necessary. How do you explain to someone you're hoping to marry that your dead sister appears in all family photographs? William wrote in frustration in 1884. Do you tell them before they see the photographs, and risk frightening them away? Or do you wait until they see for themselves, and risk them feeling deceived? There is no good answer. Then, in 1886, 14 years after the first apparition, Margaret stopped appearing in photographs. The family commissioned a portrait in October of that year, expecting what had become routine. They went to a well-established studio in Coventry, a photographer named Samuel Wright who had been recommended by friends. The sitting went normally, and when they received the finished photographs 2 weeks later, they found only the four of them, Thomas, Eleanor, James, and William. No ghostly figure. No translucent face. Margaret was simply absent. Thomas's diary entry for that day reads, "The photograph arrived today. Margaret is not in it." I find myself surprised by how much this disturbs me. I had grown accustomed to her presence, had come to expect it. Her absence feels like losing her all over again. Eleanor wept when she saw the photograph, not tears of relief but tears of loss. "She's gone," she kept saying. "She's finally gone." They tried again in December, hoping perhaps it had been an anomaly. They hired a different photographer, went to a different studio. Again, Margaret did not appear. They tried again in March 1887, and again in June. Each time, the photographs showed only the living family members. Whatever had allowed Margaret to manifest for 14 years had ceased. The investigators from the Society for Psychical Research were fascinated by this development and traveled to Ashworth to interview the family. What had changed? What variable had been different in October 1886? They examined everything: the family's emotional state, any changes in their daily routines, even the weather conditions during the photograph sittings. They could find no obvious explanation. It was William, the younger brother, who made an observation that offered a disturbing but somehow fitting theory. In 1886, William had turned 21, becoming, according to Victorian laws and social customs, a full adult. He was the youngest family member, the last to grow up under his parents' roof. On his 21st birthday in September, just 1 month before the first photograph without Margaret, the entire original family, the family who had known Margaret in life, had officially transitioned into adulthood. William shared this observation with his family one evening as they sat in the parlor, the gas lamps burning low, the photographs arranged on every surface around them. "What if," he said slowly, "Margaret was waiting for us to grow up? James and I mean. What if she was somehow watching, ensuring we safely crossed through the childhood that was denied to her?" The room fell silent. Eleanor put down her needlework, her hands trembling. Thomas closed the book he had been reading. James looked up from his correspondence. "When Margaret died, James was 14 and I was 11, William continued. "We were still children. Now James is 28 and established in business with a home of his own. I am 21 and considered a man by law. There are no more children in this family." Perhaps her task was complete. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "She was watching over you," she whispered. "She was being the big sister, even after death. Making sure her little brothers grew up safe." This interpretation, though impossible to verify, found resonance with theories from folklore and the psychology of grief. Dr. Hartley, who had studied the case for years, found William's theory compelling enough to include it in his final monograph on the subject, published in 1889. In cultures around the world, there are traditions about the spirits of children who remain close to their loved ones until certain tasks are completed or milestones are reached, Hartley wrote. The idea that Margaret Whitfield might have been present, in whatever form this presence took, until her siblings were grown and safe, offers a narrative closure that, while unprovable, provides psychological comfort and aligns with deep human beliefs about the protective nature of familial love. The theory also fit with Eleanor's long-held belief that Margaret was trying to communicate something to them. Perhaps what she had been communicating all along was simply, "I'm here. I'm watching. I haven't abandoned you." And when that message was no longer needed, when the family had healed as much as they ever would, when the brothers were grown and established in their own lives, Margaret had finally been free to move on. Thomas found a different kind of comfort in the theory. "For 14 years, we wondered why this was happening to us," he wrote in his diary in 1888. "Perhaps the answer was simpler than we thought. Margaret loved us, and love persists beyond death. When we no longer needed her presence, she let go. That seems like her, doesn't it? Always thinking of others before herself." The family never had another photograph taken where Margaret appeared. They continued to commission portraits occasionally over the years, and each time, only the living family members appeared. The phenomenon had ended as mysteriously as it had begun. The surviving photographs, 19 in total from the 14-year period, are now preserved in the archives of the Society for Psychical Research in London, with high-quality copies held at the British Library and the Royal Photographic Society. They continue to defy analysis, generating new investigations with each advancement in imaging technology. In the 1920s, the photographs were examined using the newly developed techniques of photomicrography, photographing them at high magnification to examine the structure of the emulsion at the microscopic level. Researchers found no evidence of manual manipulation, no scratches or alterations that could have created the forms, no signs of poorly executed double exposures. In the 1950s, researchers used X-ray photography to examine the glass plates, looking for any hidden structures or materials within the glass itself that might produce the images. They found nothing unusual. In the 1990s, the photographs were digitally scanned at extremely high resolution, and computer analysis was used to examine the distribution of silver particles in the emulsion. Margaret's image is integrated into the emulsion in exactly the same way as the figures of the living family members, showing the same grain structure, the same tonal values, the same characteristics that would be expected from a single, unified exposure. Dr. Jennifer Matthews, a physicist specializing in photographic technology who studied the plates in 2003, concluded, "If this is a fraud, it was executed with technical sophistication that exceeds what we believe was possible with 19th-century technology." The integration of the ghostly image into the emulsion is seamless. There are no signs of double exposure, no evidence of painting or retouching on either the plates or the prints. I cannot explain these photographs. Modern skeptics continue to propose theories. The most common is that the family was involved in an elaborate conspiracy involving multiple photographers over 14 years. Perhaps the Whitfields paid each photographer to add Margaret's image using some sophisticated darkroom technique that has since been lost to history, creating a morbid but deeply personal memorial. But this theory faces significant problems. First, the cost of bribing so many professionals would have been astronomical. The Whitfields were comfortable but not wealthy. Thomas's textile business provided a good living, but the kind of money needed to maintain such a conspiracy for 14 years would have bankrupted them. Second, several of the photographers involved had established reputations and much to lose by participating in such fraud. Frederick Hayes, for instance, had photographed members of Parliament and local nobility. His professional reputation was his livelihood. The same was true for several other photographers who captured Margaret's image. Third, and perhaps most convincingly, some of the photographers who captured Margaret's image were known skeptics who had publicly exposed previous spiritual frauds. Gerald Hopkins, the Oxford photographer, had written articles for photographic journals about fraudulent spirit photography and had demonstrated how such tricks were usually accomplished. Yet he had no explanation for how Margaret appeared in his photographs of the Whitfield family. Fourth, the controlled experiments conducted by the Society for Psychical Research in 1884 had used investigators' own equipment and materials, had marked the plates, had supervised every step from exposure to development. Unless the entire society was part of the conspiracy, which would have involved dozens of respected scientists and scholars, the controlled experiment results cannot be easily dismissed. There is also the possibility that we are dealing with something more prosaic, but no less intriguing, a systemic defect in the photographic materials of the era. The glass plates and chemical emulsions of the 19th century were produced in batches, often by small manufacturers with inconsistent quality control. If the family, by extraordinary coincidence, had acquired their plates from a defective batch that created face-like forms under certain lighting or development conditions, this could explain the consistency of the apparitions. But this theory also collapses under the weight of evidence. The photographs were taken by different photographers who used their own plates from different suppliers at different times. Some used the wet collodion process, others used the newer dryplate process introduced in the late 1870s. The probability of all these photographers, over 14 years, using materials from the same defective batch is statistically impossible. Professor Michael Davidson, a chemist who studied the case in the 1970s, attempted to recreate defects in 19th-century photographic materials that might produce face-like patterns. He experimented with contaminated chemicals, degraded emulsions, improperly washed plates, and various other defects. He produced many strange images, including some vague patterns that, with imagination, might resemble faces. But none produced the clear, detailed, consistent images seen in the Whitfield photographs. The human brain is exceptional at finding faces in random patterns, Davidson wrote in his research paper. This is why we see faces in clouds, in wood grain, in burned toast. But the Whitfield photographs do not show random patterns that might be interpreted as a face. They show specific, detailed images of the same individual, with consistent features, recognizable characteristics, and varying poses. This level of specificity cannot be explained by pareidolia or random defects. Fraud, an elaborate conspiracy involving the family and multiple photographers, though how this was executed and why so many professionals would risk their reputations remains unclear. Unknown technical phenomenon, some aspect of 19th-century photographic chemistry that we do not yet fully understand, perhaps something related to the specific emotional or psychological state of the subjects interacting with the light-sensitive materials in ways we cannot yet explain. Genuine paranormal phenomenon, the possibility that some aspect of human consciousness or emotional energy can interact with physical materials in ways that exceed our current scientific understanding. Mass delusion, the photographs show nothing unusual, and generations of people have simply convinced themselves they see something that isn't there, though the consistency of descriptions across independent observers makes this unlikely. None of these explanations is entirely satisfying. Each leaves questions unanswered, each requires us to believe something that seems improbable. The last known photograph of the family, taken in 1895, shows the now elderly parents, their hair whitened by time and a lifetime of grief. Thomas is 73, Eleanor 68. Their children stand beside them, both now middle-aged men with families of their own. James, at 37, stands with his wife Catherine and their 3 children. William, at 33, stands with his wife Mary and their young son, named Thomas after his grandfather. And in the lower right corner of the image, almost imperceptible unless one knows to look, there is a small anomaly in the emulsion. A blur, a stain, a pattern of light and shadow that, if you look from a certain angle, in a certain light, almost seems like the outline of a small face. A child's face, indistinct but somehow familiar. Was it Margaret? One final appearance, one last message. Or simply a defect in the emulsion that a grieving family chose to interpret as they wished. The photograph was taken by a young photographer named Thomas Clark, who had recently established his studio in Coventry. When asked about the anomaly, he shrugged. Sometimes plates have imperfections, he said. The chemicals aren't always consistent. It's probably nothing. But Eleanor Whitfield, examining the photograph with eyes that had dimmed with age but still saw clearly what mattered, smiled softly. It's her, she said with quiet certainty. She's saying goodbye. She's letting us know she's still there, still watching, still loving us, even though she doesn't need to appear anymore. That's Margaret. Always thinking of us, always making sure we know we're loved. Thomas didn't contradict her. After 23 years of living with the impossible, he had learned that some questions don't have answers, and some answers don't need questions. He simply took his wife's hand, and together they looked at the photograph, at their family, at the blur in the corner that might or might not be their daughter's final farewell. A final wave goodbye from someone who never had the chance to grow up but who had somehow found a way to remain, captured forever on the threshold between light and shadow, life and death, memory and presence. If these stories teach us anything, it is that the past is never truly dead. It lives in the photographs we preserve, in the stories we tell, and in the mysteries that refuse to be solved. The Whitfield family lived the rest of their lives quietly. Thomas died in 1901 at the age of 79, his business passed on to James. Eleanor lived another 8 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1909 at 82. Both are buried in the churchyard of St. Michael's, in a plot next to their daughter Margaret. James never married after Catherine's death from influenza in 1903. He devoted himself to his children and to the study of the paranormal, becoming a respected figure in the Society for Psychical Research. He published 2 books on the family's experiences, both of which remain in print today as historical documents of Victorian spiritualism. William moved to London in 1898, where he established himself as a successful merchant. He rarely spoke of his sister's apparitions, finding the attention uncomfortable. But in a letter to James written in 1920, shortly before his own death, he wrote, "I think of Margaret often. I wonder if she's still out there somewhere, watching over her brothers who are now old men. I like to think she is. I like to think that love persists, that it transcends the boundaries we believe are absolute. The photographs convinced me of that, if nothing else. Death is not the end. Love is stronger than death." The photographs themselves became famous, reproduced in books about Victorian spiritualism, analyzed in academic papers, displayed in exhibitions about the history of photography. They inspired novels, plays, even a silent film in 1924 that took considerable liberties with the actual story. But for all the attention, for all the analysis and debate, the central question remains unanswered: what actually appeared in those photographs? Technology advances, our understanding of the world expands, and we accumulate knowledge at an exponential rate. We have split the atom, mapped the human genome, and sent spacecraft beyond our solar system. We carry computers in our pockets more powerful than those that guided missions to the moon. We can manipulate matter at the molecular level, peer deep into the cosmos to observe galaxies billions of light-years away, and create artificial intelligence that can mimic human thought. Yet here is a mystery from 1872 that remains unsolved. Here are photographs that continue to puzzle experts. Here is a story that refuses to yield its secrets, no matter how sophisticated our analytical tools become. Perhaps that is the real lesson of the Whitfield photographs. Not that the paranormal exists or that it doesn't, not that there is life after death or that there isn't. Perhaps the lesson is simpler and more humbling: we do not know everything. For all our advancement, for all our technology and scientific understanding, there are still dark corners where logic fails and where we are forced to admit that perhaps, just perhaps, we do not know as much as we think about the nature of reality and what happens when we cross from one side of the veil to the other. The photographs exist. They can be viewed, examined, analyzed. They are physical objects, historical artifacts, documented evidence. But what they show, what they mean, and what they tell us about the boundaries between life and death, between presence and absence, between the material and the spiritual, these questions remain open. And perhaps that's as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, not because we lack the tools to solve them, but because in remaining unsolved, they remind us that the universe is larger and stranger than our theories can encompass. In the archives of the Society for Psychical Research in London, in a climate-controlled vault where temperature and humidity are carefully maintained to preserve these fragile glass plates, the 19 Whitfield photographs rest in custom-fitted boxes. Researchers still request access to them, still hope to find the answer that has eluded generations of investigators. And in each photograph, Margaret Whitfield looks out at us across more than a century and a half of time. A 7-year-old girl who died in 1872, who somehow appeared in photographs for 14 years afterward, whose image has been examined by countless experts and remains unexplained. She looks at us, and we look back, and across that gulf of time and mystery, a question hangs in the air: what are you trying to tell us, Margaret? What message are you trying to send? Maybe she's not trying to tell us anything. Maybe she's simply there, a reminder that love persists, that memory has power, that the bonds between family members are not easily broken, not even by death itself. Or maybe she's asking us a question: how certain are you about the nature of reality? How sure are you that you understand the boundaries between life and death, between the material and the spiritual, between what is possible and what is not? If you are fascinated by this story and want to explore more mysteries of Victorian photographs and unsolved enigmas of history, there are so many other stories waiting in the shadows. captured on dusty glass plates and forgotten negatives, awaiting someone brave enough to look closer and question what we really see when we look at the past. Because the past is not as settled as we like to believe. It is not a fixed, unchanging landscape that we can observe from a safe distance. It is alive, in its way. It speaks to us through photographs, through documents, through stories passed down. And sometimes, if we listen carefully, we hear things that should not be possible, see things that should not exist, and are forced to question everything we thought we knew. The Whitfield photographs are such a message from the past. They show us something. Whether that something is a deceased child who refused to leave her family, a strange artifact of 19th-century chemistry, an elaborate hoax that has fooled experts for generations, or something else entirely, something we lack even the framework to understand, we may never know for certain. But they make us wonder. They make us question. And perhaps, in this age of easy answers and instant information, that wondering and questioning is itself valuable. Perhaps we need mysteries like this to remind us that the universe is deeper and stranger than we imagine, that there are still questions without answers, still shadows that conceal more than they reveal. Margaret Whitfield died on April 23, 1872. But in another sense, she never left. She remains with us still, preserved forever in those impossible photographs, a mystery wrapped in an enigma, a question we cannot answer, a presence we cannot explain. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what she intended. Historical note: while the story of the Whitfield family is presented as historical fact in this narrative, readers should know that it represents one of Victorian England's most debated photographic mysteries. The photographs exist in various archives, and the debate about their authenticity continues. Whether they represent genuine paranormal phenomena, sophisticated fraud, or some unknown aspect of 19th-century photographic chemistry remains an open question, inviting each new generation to examine the evidence and draw their own conclusions.